I want to thank everybody for joining us here for our 2025 Student Scholars presentation. This is our AG. I'm A.G. Horman, by the way, the faculty of Catholic Law here at the Columbus School of Law at Catholic University of America. And on behalf of the faculty, let me thank you for zooming into the first of our presentations, I should say, in this year's Student Scholar Series. Please do stay on mute until the presentation and response are over, and then I'll open the floor to questions, which you'll signal with your raise hand features, if you will. This series, just quickly, so you know, was instituted 16 years ago in order to recognize notable legal scholarship produced by members of the student body during the previous academic year, and to foster the skills associated with presenting and defending the scholarship in a professional conference style setting. Today's presentation will be made by third-year student Abby DiOrio. Before I introduce Abby, a few words about the respondent to her presentation. Troy McCurry is an alum of our law school. He is an adjunct lecturer here as well. And he started teaching courses on election law and campaign finance law long ago. I think he was just saying 15 years ago. So a long time member of the adjunct faculty here. Troy is currently the Director of Government Relations Compliance at the Pew Charitable Trust. Prior to joining Pew, he was counsel to multiple commissioners at the Federal Election Commission and also served as senior counsel to the Republican National Committee and was counsel to Mitt Romney's 2008 presidential campaign. He also serves as a lieutenant commander and intelligence officer for the United States Navy Reserve and was deployed to Afghanistan in 2014. He received his BA in journalism from the University of Georgia and his Juris Doctorate, as I said, from Catholic Law. Thank you again to Troy for doing this. We're honored to have him help us today with Abby's presentation. And now I'll introduce our student scholar. Abby DiOrio is a 30L and has a Bachelor of Arts degree in American politics from the University of Virginia. While at Catholic Law, she has been served as the managing note and comment editor for volume 74 of the Catholic University Law Review and secretary for the First Generation Law Student Union. After law school, she will clerk at the United States Court of Federal Claims for Judge Marion Blank-Horn. Her graduate studies of American politics at UVA inspired her to explore novel issues in election law. She wanted to develop her prior education on presidential elections from a legal lens and highlight current inconsistencies in state election law. She credits Professor McCurry as an invaluable resource and helped her narrow her scope to focus on photo identification law specifically. Now I'm going to turn the floor over to Abby. And Abby, let me make you the host now. Abby is now the host. Abby is going to take over and present her scholarship entitled The Analytical Compass, a study of state voter identification requirements and combating election fraud. Abby.
Thank you, Professor Harmon. Let me try and share. Are you able to see my screen?
We can.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abby DiOrio. I'm a 3L, and before I get started on my presentation today, I just want to take another second to thank Professor McCurry. Professor McCurry served as my expert reader as I was going through the writing process last year, and he was also an amazing resource as I was preparing this presentation today. So thank you again for your mentorship and guidance throughout this. As Professor Harmon mentioned, the title of my note was The Analytical Compass, a study of state voter identification requirements and combating election fraud. I'll take a second to read my abstract. Federal elections continue to be increasingly polarized, narrow, and controversial. As states' legislatures attempt to address this reality, their statutes and regulations must implement procedures that prevent voter fraud, but do not unduly restrict a constituent's right to vote. This note analyzes states in the 5th and 9th Circuit and their efforts to effectuate this balancing act. Specifically, this note considers the state-mandated presentation of a government-issued photo ID at the ballot box, as well as the presence of additional barriers required to vote. In an effort to determine how effective these heightened regulations are at combating fraud, The note presents a comparative visualization titled the Analytical Compass. This tool synthesizes key considerations of each state's photo ID stringency, additional voting obstacles, and election-related convictions. The Analytical Compass depicts a linear trend which models a strong relationship between stringent ID requirements and the presence of other obstacles. However, it also depicts a consistent ratio of election fraud convictions despite the varying severity of each state law. So this potentially suggests that harsher voting laws are not necessarily more successful at preventing this voter fraud. This is a brief overview of what we'll cover today. We'll start with some brief background on the primary federal laws governing elections and election administration. This will include stuff like the Help America Vote Act and the key Supreme Court case, Crawford v. Marion County Election Board. After that, I will share a very pared down synthesis of states' election laws as to whether they require photo IDs or some other form of ID, as well as how strictly those regulations are actually enforced. This study specifically compares states in the Fifth and Ninth Circuits. So it looks at the state election law in the Fifth Circuit, Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, with the states in the Ninth Circuit, Alaska, Arizona, California, Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Nevada, Oregon, and Washington. So with these states in mind specifically, I'll look at the increasing importance of photo ID laws and how they impact elections. And I'll take a second to specifically look at the 2020 presidential election. And then with all this information in mind, we'll compare it to the confirmed number of election-related convictions in recent years. This all will all be applied to what I title the Analytical Compass, which is supposed to illustrate the spectrum of state laws and the restrictions and how they combat fraud. So this is a quick overview of the governing background. The foundation for all the state laws that we look at today and how they deal with election administration are all because of Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution. It says the times, places, and manners of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the place of choosing senators. So all this means is that the Constitution is giving states the ability to figure out how they want to conduct elections. So because the states have that capability, they have the freedom to figure out how these are administered, which means there are 50 different ways that states approach elections. This means that things like timing and voter registration and polling locations all vary by state. The other important rule that we should look at is the Help America Vote Act of 2002. This act was made by Congress after famously close Bush-Gore race of 2000. And the Help America Vote Act is very broad, and it is supposed to implement a mandatory minimum for states when they're going through election administration. So states still have the ability to use their discretion and vary in how they add additional laws on top of it. But the federal minimum in the Help America Vote Act provides some uniformity when these elections are taking place. Specifically, for the purpose of our conversation today, the important aspect of the Help America Vote Act is the one I have highlighted here, and it's basically requiring that when a potential voter is registering to vote, they have to provide either a valid driver's license or a social security number. So the reason we care about this right now is as we consider state laws and how they govern when constituents show up to the polls, this is all assuming that the people who are showing up to the ballot box have already registered and they are eligible to vote. So I think that this is important to keep in mind because these people have already been vetted to some extent if they have a valid registration. Finally, as I mentioned before, Crawford v. Marion County Election Board is the key Supreme Court case that's governing election laws and specifically photo ID requirements. So in this case, Indiana had passed a law that said that individuals who wanted to vote would have to bring a government-issued photo ID to the polls before they could enter and cast their vote. And the plaintiffs in this case said that it was an unconstitutional burden on their right to vote, but the court ultimately disagreed. They said that when states have these strong interests, such as preventing fraud, they're allowed to put this burden of imposing a photo ID requirement on their constituents, so long as it's not unduly burdensome and non-discriminatory. So that's kind of the foundation of how, the lens in which we look at these state laws. They are allowed to have photo ID laws, but there are these mandatory minimums that are ensuring when people show up to vote, they've already been vetted to some extent, whether it be through their driver's license or social security number. So what this looks like is states, the plain text of their laws kind of falls into these three buckets. Either they're not requiring an ID at all when people show up to the polls, they're requiring some sort of non-photo ID, or they are requiring a photo ID like Indiana originally tried in Crawford v. Marion County. But the way this actually plays out is a little more varying, just because states differ in how they prioritize laws and how they enforce laws, and kind of how it looks in real life. And so I offer instead to you this spectrum at the bottom of my slide. It's from 0 to 4 instead of 1 to 3. And it's this idea that there are the standard buckets of requiring an ID, requiring a non-photo ID, or requiring a photo ID, but they're not always enforced. So instead of looking at these states in the Fifth and Ninth Circuit using this 1 to 3 kind of scale, I looked at it in this 0 to 4 scale. No ID required. States typically would instead use a signature to verify. Non-photo ID required, and it's not strictly enforced. They do require a photo ID, but it's similarly not strictly enforced. There is a non-photo ID requirement, and it is strictly enforced. And of course, there is a photo ID required, and it is strictly enforced. So with this in mind, I would like to apply it to the states in the Fifth and Ninth Circuit. So I'll share that now. It is a high-level overview. I did not think that it would be timely to go through every state's individual statute and how they govern this. But as you can see on the left, there is the scale that I offered in the previous slide on 0 to 4. And then this is how states in the Fifth and Ninth Circuit kind of fell. So in the Fifth Circuit, you can see that all three states are requiring, like by code, their voters to present some sort of photo ID at the polls. The difference is whether or not they're actually enforcing it. Mississippi they are turning people away more often, whereas Louisiana and Texas on paper are requiring people to have a photo ID, but maybe in reality, they're not enforcing it as strictly. Compared to the Ninth Circuit, of course, there is a little bit more disparity in how people are falling, but no state is falling as high up on the scale as requiring a photo ID and strictly enforcing it. So as states are kind of implementing these different rules, they're all balancing kind of the same issues, where they're trying to, of course, combat potential fraud, but they can't overly burden a constituent's right to vote. So it's just this balancing act of how far is too far. And the way they fall on it is very reflective of how lawmakers present their priorities and how they fall in giving weight to these competing interests. So you can see here, supporters of stronger photo ID laws, of enforcing these laws, they credit things like bolstering election integrity, providing enhanced election security, and safeguarding voter confidence as their reasons for either requiring a photo ID law or strictly enforcing whatever law they have in place. On the other hand, opponents of those really stringent laws say that they don't want to unnecessarily prevent voters who should be able to cast their ballot from doing so. They want to protect, if you have not some, you lack some outside reason for not being able to vote, if you have still maintained that right, you should be able to cast your ballot. And of course, maybe a little naively, some may argue, Nevada says voter fraud is rare and voter convenience is important. Of course, voter convenience is important, but it's hard to stipulate it like that. When we compare this to the Fifth and Ninth Circuit, it is a pretty strong relation between how lawmakers in the Fifth Circuit and Ninth Circuit kind of align priorities with how the courts do. So as you see here, the Fifth Circuit has said that a state has considerable discretion in deciding what is an adequate level of effectiveness to serve its important interests of voter integrity. And the Fifth Circuit, of course, here is upholding Crawford v. Marion County. States do have the ability to implement photo ID restrictions if they want to. But this language kind of implies that the courts maybe aren't going to get involved if states do opt to do that. When you compare this language to what the Ninth Circuit has said, the Ninth Circuit has said they aim to uphold not severe restrictions that are generally applicable, even-handed, politically neutral, and which protect the reliability and integrity of the election process. I think the interesting language here is not severe. This seems like the Ninth Circuit is actually imposing some sort of judgment call on how far is too far with these restrictions, and potentially prioritizing this voter accessibility as opposed to any impending fraud concerns. So as we're having this conversation, I just want to take a moment to highlight why this actually matters, and how this plays in to, the greater scheme of elections. And I think it's important to highlight, greater than candidate favorability or political donations or, public support. Elections are determined by who actually shows up to the polls and votes. So the difference between someone getting to access a ballot and not is very pivotal in these elections. So in the past 3 recent presidential elections, not including 2024, just because we're still waiting for a lot of information on that, but 2020, 2016, and 2012 all had, I think, some of the highest voter turnout that we've seen in recent decades. But with that, we know that there's been a lot of debate over how this has been playing out. So if you look at the 2020 presidential election specifically, at that time, there were nearly 29 million voting aged people who didn't have like a valid driver's license. And as we saw from the Help America Vote Act and in some of these state laws, that's required not only to register, but to show up at the polls in some states. And over 7 million of those 29 million people didn't have adequate substitute documentation to show up to the polls. So even if they were able to register appropriately, they might have still been prevented from accessing the ballots when they show up. And just to show the gravity of those numbers, the difference of the popular vote in 2020 was just a little over 7 million people. And of course, the elections aren't determined by the popular vote, but it just goes to show kind of the gravity of these people having access or not. Following the 2020 election, we know there were a lot of contests and appeals with the calls and ballot workers and vote counting machines were put under the scrutiny that we haven't seen since like probably the 2000 election. So this very narrow margin kind of influenced how people view the electoral system as a whole. So in response to the 2020 election, we've had 16 states that have passed either like brand new voter photo ID laws, or they're heightening it. So if they maybe were requiring a non-photo ID before, now they've changed their laws to require people to present a government issued photo ID at the polls. So that's 6 of these 16 states. They've now heightened their photo ID requirement. So it goes to show where we are at this place in time. At the time that I was working with Professor McCurry and writing this note, it was 2023. We weren't really sure what was to come of the 2024 election. In fact, when I wrote this note, I still had Joe Biden listed as the 2024 candidate. There's just so much that we don't know, and it evolves so quickly, but it goes to show just how important these can be, and how these rules are enforced or not can really affect the turnout of elections. So now I've provided here this is a breakdown of the confirmed voter fraud related convictions between 2016 and 2020. And the reason I offer this now is because without this kind of empirical evidence of what's happening with fraud or what's not happening with fraud, it's kind of hard to debate this ethereal fear of fraud versus how hard it is for people to actually get the proper identification. So it's important to apply numbers when we're doing this legal analysis. But as Professor McCurry has graciously titled the challenge of chasing ghosts. It's hard to put numbers on these things because when someone shows up to the polls and they left their driver's license at home and so they get turned away, there's no one really there counting that. Or if someone has registered to vote, in a completely valid way, and then, their license expires in the week between, like before the election, we don't have a very clear grasp of how frequently that's happening just because there's no one there measuring it. So I offer that at this point because I think it's important to keep in mind. We can look at the numbers that are confirmed, but there's still a lot that's happening at the polls or before the polls that we can't measure. So I offer you to just kind of look at these numbers and understand these are just between 2016 and 2020 criminal convictions related to voter fraud or election fraud in these states. So looking at the factors that we've kind of walked through already, my note used the analytical compass to kind of plot these points, the factors that we've looked at so far, the voter photo ID requirements and their enforcement, the number of election-related convictions between 2016 and 2020. And then I also measured additional regulatory obstacles that I have listed on the next slide. But the goal of this was to kind of plot each state's laws and enforcement on this sort of scale. And so this is just supposed to kind of serve as a key for the actual compass. States kind of fall into one of these four quadrants. It's either they have high photo ID scrutiny and they do have these high obstacles present, or they have, really strict photo ID requirements and not a lot else. They're entirely, more lax compared to more stringent states, or they flip-flop. And so I have them plotted in this way to try and serve as a comparison between these really heavy restrictions and potentially the fraud that they're working to prevent. So I'll share now. We've seen this list before. This was the buckets, the spectrum of the photo ID requirements specifically, but the other obstacles that I measured are listed here. Lack of same-day voter registration, no online registration, additional documentation for registration that's like beyond what's required from the Help America Vote Act. The state prohibits any form of automatic voter registration. Election day is not a state holiday. No early voting, no mail-in voting. Mail-in postage is not paid for by the state. The state requires a vetted excuse to vote via absentee ballot and excessive wait time at the polls. I won't go into the minute details of each state's laws and where they checked and they didn't, but basically the way I approached analyzing these was a very simple tallying system. I went through each state's governing law and checked off whether or not they had these other obstacles present. I will say something that was interesting to me when I was going through this is this obstacle 9, the states requiring like a approved basically excuse to vote via absentee, was a complete circuit split. So the states in the Fifth Circuit, Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi, they all had this in their code that someone would have to submit to have some pre-approved, like, vettable excuse to vote via absentee, whereas no state in the Ninth Circuit did. So I found that interesting as I was going through this, but applying these factors I share with you now, this is kind of how the state's laws landed on this compass. As we can see, the x-axis here is the additional obstacles that were present. Those were those 10 that we just tallied. And the y-axis is the 0 to 4 scale on how strict they are with both their photo ID requirements to begin with and whether or not they're enforced. I added this little dotted line. This is just to show the average between the two. So this is just kind of the middle ground for all of them. The bubbles for each state are scaled using that election related conviction information that we saw, but I did adjust for population size. So, just because Texas has a much greater population than Hawaii, that's been accounted for in this scale. And so what we see here is, a pretty linear trend, more or less. There is a blatant lack of plot points having, high photo ID enforcement and lack of other obstacles, and vice versa. There's not a lot of there are no states in these circuits that have high obstacles, but are very lax with their photo ID requirements. So I think this is completely in line with what we saw both in the state lawmakers and in the courts in the Fifth and Ninth Circuit. If you think that the best way to combat election fraud is to have really tough voter laws and to try and regulate it as much as possible, I think it makes complete sense that you would be consistent in requiring photo ID and also having these other hoops to jump through to get to that point. I'll also share this line here is just to serve as like the median relationship between the photo ID scale and the presence of additional obstacles. I found this especially interesting just because of how Mississippi, Louisiana, and Nevada fall on this plot. It's almost a perfect spectrum of how states approach things. So you can see here, Louisiana is an extreme outlier. They have very high photo ID requirements, and they also have a presence of strong additional obstacles in their laws. And they cite things like election fraud, prevention, and maintaining integrity in elections as the reason that they implement things with this strength. Nevada says similar things, but they also really prioritize voter accessibility and people having access to the polls if they're eligible. And Louisiana has very similar rationale. They want to prevent fraud, but they also want to make sure that someone who's qualified to access the ballots is able to do so. So I was excited with these results to see that the relationship is fairly consistent. I think it's also interesting to point out that despite this complete, polar opposite approach in how to combat fraud and tackle these interests, these three states have pretty similar, like, proportioned election fraud convictions. I am not a data scientist, so I can't give, the p-value of anything, but these are comparable. And so I think it leaves to question whether or not the enforcement of these laws or having more accessible laws or trying to find somewhere in the middle is doing the job that lawmakers maybe think that it is, just because the election fraud convictions are fairly consistent across the board. This is a recap of kind of what we've discussed already. There's, most states are falling within two of four quadrants, which makes sense because if you're prioritizing these heightened rules, then you would be kind of even in how you implement it. Nevada, Louisiana, and Mississippi are kind of offering a very conveniently perfect spectrum of how these laws are implemented, but at the same time, they have a similar number of election-related convictions when it's adjusted for their population size. So this potentially suggests that harsher voting laws are not necessarily more successful at preventing election fraud, but it is important to keep in mind this context that Professor McCurry offers of this chasing ghosts reality, that we don't have the complete numbers on who's being turned away at the polls, who's attempting some sort of fraudulent activity and is failing. There's a lot we don't know. With that, this is a brief conclusion of just what we've discussed today, but I hope we can take away from it is that the way that these voting laws are written and the way they are implemented and the way they are actually enforced has a very strong capability of affecting the turnouts and the results of these elections. So my goal with this compass that I created and presented today was hopefully many people can use it in different capacities. Ideally, maybe lawmakers, people in state legislatures can look at where their state falls in comparison with other jurisdictions. Maybe constituents of those states can actually view where they fall on this spectrum, and maybe they can use it as a weighing of whether that's where they want to fall and how they want to contact their elected officials in response to it. And of course, legal professionals, it's always important to evaluate a circuit split and evaluate how different governing laws are favorable or not, given whatever analysis you're trying to gear towards. I think that is all I have for this presentation. Thank you again, Professor McCurry, for your help, and Professor Harmon for setting this up. I will give you the hosting capabilities again now, I think.
Thank you, Abby. I appreciate your hard work on this and a very cogent and clear presentation. I'm going to turn things over to Professor McCurry now to conduct the response.
Thank you, Professor Harbin, and thank you, Abby. I'll start off by saying, as someone that's worked in this field both academically and professionally, practically for almost 2 decades now, working with you on this paper really was enlightening to me. I learned a lot. There's always, when you are in the thick and throes of this topic, there's a lot of speculation and guesswork and thinking, but the way that you laid these things down and analyzed it as thoroughly you did and presented it in a way that's so easily digestible is really remarkable. And like I said, I learned a lot from it. So you should really be proud of the effort you put on this. So I've got a few questions I'm going to ask, just try to pull some strings, some threads here on this topic and on how your paper addresses it. And the first one I want to ask is, as you mentioned, Crawford v. Marion County is the seminal case on this topic, and it's where the constitutional law basis for voter ID really came into place in our system. And as you mentioned in your paper, Justice Stevens was the critical vote, the critical justice involved in Crawford v. Marion County. As we know, it was in Indiana. It was a facial challenge at the time. But he cited on finding that the law was constitutional, irrespective of the burdens that were placed on potential voters. Not too much long after that, and after he left the court, Justice Stevens kind of expressed a little bit of skepticism, and I won't say the word regret, but he seemed to have a little bit of thoughts of maybe not quite sure that this was the right decision, or how it was applied later on was the right path to be taken by state lawmakers. So I just kind of ask you how would you address that? How do you think that we should look at this with Stevens' seminal role in the case that because obviously we wouldn't be here discussing this if the case had been decided a different way. So that case is in his writing was so important, but his later writings on it are as important as well. How would you address those?
Absolutely. Thank you, Professor McCurry. I know this is something we've discussed before. Justice Stevens came out a little bit later, and he was doing an interview with, I believe, the Washington Post, and he said something along the lines of, when he was going through this case initially, he had done some of his own outside research, and he had this kind of conflict between, do I apply only the facts and the law that I'm hearing in the scope of oral arguments and briefs, or should I be taking this outside information? And it sounds like some of the extracurricular research that he was doing implied that maybe the purpose of these laws was maybe to restrict voter access in a different way. And so it's hard when it's presented under this context of preventing fraud. Justice Stevens did ultimately say that he applied the facts within the scope of the case. He did not use this outside information because it wouldn't be fair to the overall decision. But I think he did kind of vocalize this discomfort with it. And he didn't go as far as to say that he would have decided different, like changed his mind if he were to go back now. But it was interesting to kind of hear that hesitation. I think that obviously when Indiana was going forward with this law, their state interest was that they were saying they needed to combat fraud, that the current law that was in place, they wanted to replace it with, requiring photo IDs because of fraud. And opponents of that argument said that Indiana was not having a problem with fraud at the time. Like the law that was currently in place was more or less doing its job. It wasn't like they were seeing heightened numbers of attempted fraud or confirmed like bad actors doing anything. So to do it under this guise of it being an issue of election fraud, it didn't stand up to the muster of a lot of people. So I think that's fair, because of course, if there's a legitimate issue of fraud, that's something that needs to be addressed. But I think a bigger thing to consider is the way that the public shapes the law and the way that the public views elections. Because when individuals are worried about election fraud or they're losing faith in this system, regardless of, whatever they are or aren't basing it in. It matters because it affects how we view this overall system. If people have completely lost faith in elections and public servants and their elected officials, it doesn't really have teeth anymore, and that's not useful. So I think that, of course, every lawmaker ever is trying to answer this question. I'm sure everyone has a different answer, but in my mind, if you have to strike this balance, maybe we should also be keeping an eye out for how fraud is actually playing out under these rules, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes great sense. I want to pull that thread a little bit more though. So I mean, like, what is like, this is obviously a hot button issue, right? And it kind of raises its head every election cycle now. And I think what this paper's done a good did a very good job of is to try to lay it down and what's the facts, right? What's the real information as best as we can, as best as we can obtain, and something that's not perfectly obtainable as far as information is concerned. But obviously it's hot button. It's very emotional, and a lot of public opinion on this, and it splits of like people saying like, oh, you've got the sides that are like, oh, there's fraud, we've got to stop it. Integrity is the thing, right? And the other side is like, no, like sometimes it's really hard for people to get government issued voter IDs, and the state makes it hard to do. And so we shouldn't disenfranchise those folks because the state creates this burden to like you have to have an ID in order to vote, and it's not exactly easy to get an ID, right? So and that creates the emotions that go, that surround this topic a little bit. But for a lawmaker, like, what do they do? Like, how do they actually, in your opinion, and after laying this out, like, what is the proper role of public opinion in shaping this topic, and how a lawmaker should address this topic of trying to strike the balance?
I think that's a great question. Thank you. I mean, the most immediate response is lawmakers care what the public thinks because they vote them in, whether or not it's founded in legitimate fraud or legitimate inaccessibility to a license. These are the people who show up and vote for you. So I think that is having an influence because people want to keep their jobs. But I think when you're striking this balance, um, I maybe invite lawmakers to look back to those mandatory minimums under the Help America Vote Act. Like, under that act, to register, you need a driver's license or you need a social security number. So that's the foundation. The state laws after this are governing, okay, you've registered and now you're showing up to the polls. What do we expect from you? And so I think having that context makes me a little more assured that there is already a vetting process happening. People aren't showing up to the polls and being like, oh, I didn't know I had to register. But here I'm a citizen of Virginia. Can I commit? Like, it's already having that backstop in place. And so I think how you weigh those interests, some places, like the most extreme case I saw was in Alaska. If you go and you don't have a driver's license or you don't have a piece of mail, but the poll worker recognizes you, that is a valid verification of your identification. Like, that's a verification of who you are. And I think that can happen in Alaska because I'm sure those polling locations are serving a lot less people and they probably know each other more than polling location in maybe Texas. So I think keeping in mind the constituents you're trying to serve and the realities of where you are is valuable. But I think appreciating that there is this minimum that people have to be legitimate eligible voters to register in the first place is something that I hope they can prioritize a little more.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
Thank you.
So switching gears a little bit again on, so that, that covers the public opinion, and obviously public opinion drives legislators to vote certain ways because of the elections are cyclical. But taking the public opinion aside, so I will say that I thought that your analytical compass, the visualization really is striking, and I know you put a lot of work into it, and it's very illustrative of the issue. But how do you think lawmakers or legal advocates could use the analytical compass, that visual representation you've created, to help make better laws, to advocate for better policies and around this topic? And how might that graphic help in addressing disparities in vote and how voters can access the ballot in these different states?
Thank you. I think I mean, I hope that it can be used in different capacities for different people in their roles. I think for lawmakers specifically, I know that I appreciate a visualization of how things are actually being implemented. I think it's useful to kind of see where you're falling on a map or a spectrum. If there is this, kind of universal shift in a certain direction, then that might be indicative of, where the public opinion is pulling, where, courts are leaning in a certain way. And so if you're a lawmaker in Mississippi and you see that you're kind of already an outlier, both in your photo ID enforcement and your presence of other restrictions, then maybe that would give you some food for thought as you try and implement new rules, as opposed to if you see that maybe a lower state, lower on the scale state like Nevada starts having voter fraud issues pop up. They can see, oh, well, maybe we are, not implementing this to the extent that other states are. And so from that context, I hope that it can serve as sort of a gauge when people are proposing new laws or trying to figure out where they are in juxtaposition to other states. I think from a public perspective, if you are just a constituent of a state, or maybe you're a part of an advocacy group, it's valuable to see what laws you're facing. How do these compare to how other states are approaching things, and does it seem more or less consistent with other states? I think that if you have a photo ID qualm that you want to bring up with a lawmaker, and you're trying to bring it up in Louisiana compared to California, compared to Mississippi, those are going to be different battles. So I think that insight could be valuable from that sort of individual perspective. But ultimately, things continue to evolve, as we've seen as we were working on this note last year. Nothing is really stuck in place, and things are constantly evolving. So if this were to continue to be used, I would probably encourage some sort of recalibration based on new laws.
That makes perfect sense. And as you mentioned, there's the 16 states, and it's always in flux, that because it's a hot button topic, there's
Mhm.
always pressure to make these adjustments in state legislatures. So hopefully literature like this will help guide that. And that's kind of leads to my final question, because I know we kind of wanted to save some time for others to ask questions as well. But so how what is there's so obviously, once again, there's the tension between ensuring access to the ballot box and preventing voter fraud. And in your mind, with all the analysis you did in creating this paper, where's the tipping point? Where is the point where there's an overcorrection of preventing fraud that starts, actually causing disenfranchisement? And where's the balance point, and where's the tipping point on these?
I think it's a great question. I feel like it's hard to maybe quantify in a very specific sense. I think that in some of these states where you have really, really stringent restrictions that are being really strictly enforced, um, it is going to disproportionately affect certain groups. I think that, as I mentioned in my note, I might not have in my presentation today, but there is data and evidence supporting that when you have these heightened uh, voter election laws, there is lower voter turnout. And so if you are in a state like the Fifth Circuit, where you have these laws where if you want to vote absentee, it has to be for one of these 5 valid reasons. A lot of people are going to be affected by that, even if they are otherwise eligible to vote, because they maybe are not thinking about needing to submit for some sort of approval. Maybe they, work an hourly job and can't take time off to go submit that request, or maybe they're elderly and low mobility, and they're not thinking about, going to a location to request an absentee ballot to use later. I think that there is evidence supporting that it is disproportionately affecting low income, elderly, minority groups. And so that is something to consider. Of course, all of these laws are just a balancing test. It's just we have to kind of compete against wanting to eliminate fraud and making sure that people can vote. And so it's just unfortunately or fortunately just sort of a judgment call on how much disenfranchisement is worth combating this fraud. And I think that each state, as we've seen, both like in the text of their statutes, but also in their, advisory committee notes or in their public statements that they make for articles, it is just a value judgment of how much you want to appeal to one over the other.
I think that's perfectly said. As someone that works in the public policy space, it always comes down to that. Like, I work for the Pew Charitable Trust. We talk about we're data driven, and we are, but there are always at the end of the day in public policy are value judgments that are made, and that's on every topic, and this one included. And I'll just before I finish up, turn it back over to Professor Harmon. I just want to say that like what you've explained here is not only, I imagine in the world of academia, when you write and you create these things, you're always trying to move the ball forward. And you and I talked about this, so just knowledge and information that didn't exist before, but also allowing opportunities for further research and further studies and further writing. And I think your paper does a good job of both moving the ball forward and opening up those future avenues of research and study. So I once again, applaud you for that. So
thank you, Professor McCurry. Thank you.
Thank you both. Let me just jump in real quick because I have a few questions. I'm sure y'all your concerted wisdom can dispose of them real quickly. But a couple of things that I wanted to ask real fast. You talked about enforcement levels. At certain states don't enforce certain things, or you can't really see that they're enforcing. How do you gather that kind of data? How do you know whether they're enforcing it or not? So how strong is that data? The second question real quickly would be, is there really a correlation or a causal relationship between conviction of fraud and prevention of fraud? I mean, that you might have convicted some people and, a few of those, because there may be some reasons why we don't go after those people or as hard or as many or whatever resources, whatever, but you might be stopping it, so that kind of thing. Third thing is, when you do catch somebody for fraud, what does that kind of case look like? I mean, what did they do, and how did they stop it? And then the fourth thing is, would a national holiday solve some of these things for voting? All right, so I'll turn it over to y'all.
Sure. I can try to go in order. I think the first question about how do you measure the enforcement, I was able to pull a lot of data from a study that was done by Scott Schroefnagel. I think I mispronounced that. It's linked in the slides. But they did an entire survey of every state's law, every state's enforcement, and they did a study with, a plethora of variables. I specifically looked at their data pull of the photo ID enforcement levels, and I believe the way they collected it was comparing. I believe it was they looked at the text of the law, but they also looked at any records they had of poll workers reporting certain inconsistencies or problems in that way. That's something I can look back on the study and confirm for you, but I was able to use that data that was sourced on the slide. Now I'm going to forget the order of the question.
Second was the thing about the causal relationship or correlation between conviction and prevention.
Absolutely. I think this was a conversation that Professor McCurry and I had throughout the entire time I was writing. It's so hard to differentiate, correlation versus causation. Famously, it can't be tied in that way. And we don't even know the full depth of things because, as Professor McCurry says with the chasing ghosts, that's what we can confirm some fraud was. We don't know if there was other, bad actors who failed, like they weren't successful, and so it didn't get counted. Right. So I think what we hope to achieve with this paper, and what I wanted to achieve with this paper, is get a gauge of what information we confirmed have and plot it in that way. But I think that is a completely fair assessment. We don't actually, know on a holistic scale how much this is actually happening. If that makes sense, Professor McCurry.
It does. Yeah. And Troy, you might want to hop in on that. And then the third thing, just to remind you, because I know I blitzed y'all with them, but the third thing was, what does a case of fraud conviction look like? What did they do? How did they catch them? And the fourth thing was the holiday question.
Sure. So sorry, Professor McCurry, did you want to speak on?
I'll say, yeah. I mean, I think honestly, yes. I mean, anytime in any sort of criminal aspect, when there's, when there are convictions, they act as deterrents, right? I mean, I think that's just kind of universally, a known. I'm not sure these things get publicized very much. To answer your case of like what it looks like. So most states have, in their election codes will have criminal aspects for things, and it really just depends on what people are doing, right? Like, and it varies, just like all these things do in criminal codes and state law. It's from like, oh, I just tried, my wife died, but I still requested 2 absentee ballots and I filled them both in, right? And that's usually misdemeanor type stuff, and it's what you would expect from a criminal conviction for a misdemeanor like that, right? And then you've got like the larger ones of like, in North Carolina a couple years back, there was this massive scheme of absentee ballot fraud, and those guys went to jail, like real, big boy prison, right? Because it was so it varies on that. But I will say, to your point, yeah, I think that, when there are people that try these huge schemes and they go to prison, people are like, I'm not trying that again, or I'm not doing that because those guys went to prison and I'm not going to prison. So I think, in any sort of sense, there's a deterrence rule in that. I will say on the holiday thing, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, it's, there's all these different things that are like making voting easier. And the thing about it is, I was like, what do you do to counter voter ID necessities? And this is what I'll say. I said this to Jason Kander, who was the Attorney General of Missouri at the time. He was on a big kick on this and he was going around. And I said to him, I was like, your organization is raising millions of dollars to promote and overturn voter ID bans. And that's fine and whatever. But wouldn't it be more useful for you to spend that money on just figuring out ways to get people to get voter IDs? Like, if it really is impossible to get a voter ID in the state of Mississippi, to pick on Professor Harmon's home state, and I'm not sure that it is, but if it is, why, if you got $5 million, you can rent a lot of vans and go to the people and put them in the vans and take them to the DMV and help them get the driver's licenses. So, I mean, I'm not sure a holiday does that, but I do think states should take in consideration like how really hard, and Abby's paper does this in some sense of like, how hard is it to get a voter ID? And in some states it's hard, in some states it's not. And I think if you're going to require someone to have a voter ID, you should make like it pretty reasonably easy in order to get that thing. So, yeah.
Wouldn't a holiday at least help, like Abby's point about people just can't get off work to go,
Yeah, no, for sure. Absolutely. And I think that's where you've seen the arguments on a different topic of where early voting is, right? The holiday itself, but having early voting, and this is kind of in the world, is kind of settled where it's usually 2 to 3 weeks now, universally. So, but people, it's not vote on Tuesday, the second Tuesday in
Right.
November. It's like, you know what? There's an early voting site on Saturday that I can go to. Or if I'm working shifts, then I can go on the Monday before the week before, right? So I think early voting, so not necessarily a holiday itself, but an early, because at the end of the day, if you have a national holiday, there's the Target is still open, right? People still working at the Target on Christmas Eve. So, but I think that's where early voting really does help some of this, is alleviate the pressure of like, oh, you got a longer time in order to vote within reason. I think these are value judgments as well of like how long early voting should be, but having early voting, I think, does relieve some of the pressure and is similar to your point, I think, on the national holiday.
I think I agree with that. To Professor Harmon's question, it maybe is a separate issue, but I do see the value in having Election Day be a holiday. Let people, we're utilizing schools anyway, we're utilizing these public places. Maybe it gives more people the opportunity to show up to the polls. But this question that we tried to address in this note of the photo ID requirement specifically, I don't know if that's exactly addressed, as Professor McCurry says, by these holidays. I think given the context of the Help America Vote Act, where everyone has to have a valid ID if they're going to register in the first place, or they have to have a social security number. If you register to vote however far out, months in advance, and then your driver's license expires a week before election day, you were an eligible voter when you registered, and now the fact that your state mandates that you present an ID at the polls, whereas somewhere else you could just bring in a piece of mail, that's making the difference between whether or not you get to cast a ballot. So I think that, of course, these are all value judgment calls. There are a lot of different variables and obstacles that are going into how these elections are conducted, but outside the fact of the presence of these photo ID requirements, I think that there is value in making it a national holiday. Yeah. I think it's a regional one here, maybe.
It,
Yeah.
I'm going to open the floor up to any other questions anybody has. We've got about 5 minutes left. Or anybody else want a question? Or just in the interest of time, I don't want to keep you all longer than you've got. But anybody have a question from the field they'd like to ask? Just scanning real quickly. Failing that right now, looks like people may have some more thoughts, and if so, I'm sure you can get them to me, and I would forward them to Abby, and Troy would help her with those questions. But I think this is a fascinating topic, an important topic. I think that it's incredibly topical, which is what we're always saying. We always ask our students to write things that are immediate and important, and the trust in the system, as Abby said, is crucial to a democracy. People just stop trusting it. They just don't. They then we've become something we wouldn't want to be. So I thank you for taking this important topic on, and Troy, for you encouraging it and giving your considered wisdom to it. This is the first of our student scholars presentations. We'll have another next month. There will be a story on this, and the video will be available on our website. So thank you again, Abby. Thank you, Professor McCurry. Thank you all for coming today.
Thank you, Professor Harmon.
Goodbye.
Thank you.